They used to say that Boston could feel a change in weather before anyone read the numbers, not through thermometers, but through sound. Ships groaned differently in the harbor. Brick cooled a little slower, and steel, when pushed beyond its patience, spoke in sharp, uneasy murmurs. In January of 1919, the North End lived under one such murmur. For months the neighborhood had grown accustomed to it. A deep, metallic strain that drifted across Commercial Street at odd hours, as if something enormous were breathing beneath its own weight. People paused when they heard it, bakers, sailors, immigrants on their way to work, but only for a moment. The war had just ended, and the city was full of noises no one questioned anymore. The tank stood there like a shadow made solid. 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, dark, cold, and filled with more molasses than the entire neighborhood could ever hope to use. Children sometimes pressed their hands to its surface, searching for the warm spots where sweetness seeped through the seams. Their mothers scraped it into jars for bread and beans, never asking why it leaked at all. Yet on certain winter mornings, before the sun reached the harbor, the tank made a different sound, a low, heavy creak that settled into the bones of the street, a sound that did not belong to storage or industry, but to strain. Few remembered those whispers years later, but they were there. The first hints that Boston was holding its breath, waiting for something that would arrive not as fire or storm, but as a wave no one had ever imagined. Long before the wave came, the North End already lived close to the edge of too many things. Too close to the harbor winds, too close to the factories, too close to the narrow alleys where thousands of families shared walls thin as paper and hopes thinner still. Most who lived there were newcomers, Italians, Irish, Portuguese, men and women who carried more memories in their pockets than coins. They worked in fish markets, in canneries, swept the floors of warehouses, stitched boots, roasted peanuts on street corners. If Boston had a heartbeat, it was here, beating in tenements stacked like crates near the docks. And rising above all that life stood the tank. It was impossible to ignore. Dark metal against the pale winter sky, a circle of steel so wide it seemed to block the horizon. Even those who passed it daily could never quite decide if it looked like a promise of industry or a warning. Children joked that it was a second harbor, one filled with sweetness instead of salt. Sailors complained that its shadow fell wrong across the street. Mothers whispered that no good ever came from buildings too big to understand. Yet no one truly questioned it. The country had just emerged from war, a time when factories worked without pause, when materials were rationed, when speed mattered more than comfort. If a tank needed to be built quickly, people assumed the men in charge had done what was necessary. But the truth was simpler and far heavier. The tank was never a symbol of progress. It was a container built to hold pressure, cost, and urgency, and it held them far more tightly than it ever held molasses. The story of the tank began 4 years earlier, in 1915, when the Purity Distilling Company sought a place to store molasses arriving from the Caribbean. Molasses was valuable then, not for kitchens, but for war. Distilled, it became ethanol, the quiet fuel behind explosives and rum alike. Time was short, demand was rising, and oversight in those days was thin as steam. So the company chose a man named Arthur Gell to oversee the project. He was not an engineer, he had never built a structure of this size, but he understood budgets and that, for some, was qualification enough. The tank went up fast, too fast for caution, too fast for testing. Instead of filling it with water to check for leaks, workers splashed in barely 6 inches before declaring it sound. The rivets were rushed, the steel plates were thinner than recommended. Some were of a grade that would turn brittle in cold weather. Yet the tank stood there anyway, proud and tall, as if unaware of the shortcuts buried in its bones. When the first shipment of molasses arrived, 700,000 gallons, the truth began seeping out, literally. Dark streaks oozed between the rivets, dripping down the sides in slow, sticky trails. Children gathered it in pails. Mothers brought it home in jars. Nobody questioned why sweetness now came from the street instead of the grocer. For the company, embarrassment was greater than alarm. They did not reinforce the tank. They did not call an inspector. They simply found paint the color of molasses and coated over every leak. A coat of paint can hide darkness, but it cannot silence it, and the tank had begun to groan. January of 1919 arrived colder than most. For weeks, temperatures hovered near zero, locking the harbour in crusted frost and turning the North End's streets brittle underfoot. Molasses, thick even in summer, stiffened inside the tank until it behaved less like syrup and more like a sheet of resin. When metal grows cold, it grows stubborn, and the steel plates of the tank, already thin, already strained, tightened in ways no one could see. Then, just days before the disaster, another shipment arrived. 600,000 gallons of molasses, this time warmed so it could be pumped easily into the tank. Hot syrup met frozen syrup. Viscosity broke. Fermentation stirred in the depths. Gases expanded in the darkness where no one was listening. Pressure rose, slowly at first, then with urgency. Residents said the groans grew louder that week, sharper, more insistent. Some described it like the sound of a ship twisting against its moorings, others like a train wheel catching on metal. But winter dulls more than cold. It dulls suspicion. People heard the noise and returned to their errands, their shifts, their early morning routines. The tank, however, heard itself. It felt the weight inside, pushing against every seam, every rivet, every decision made 4 years earlier in the name of speed and savings. And on the morning of January 15th, the steel stopped bending. It prepared to break. No one who survived spoke much about the exact second before it happened. Some said the air itself tightened, as if the neighborhood had drawn one long breath it could not release. Others recalled a single, piercing snap, the kind that makes a man turn his head even when he believes he imagined it. At 12:30 p.m., the first rivet shot across the street. Metal ricocheted against brick with the sharpness of gunfire. Another followed, then another, a staccato of failure rattling through the narrow streets. It was the sound of something giving up after years of holding too much. Witnesses later said, the tank did not explode all at once. It opened itself piece by piece, like a seam tearing under the weight of its own secret. Then the steel plate buckled, and the world changed. A wall of molasses, 15 feet high, dark as tar, and moving faster than any liquid that thick should move, burst into the open with a force that defied imagination. It carried the weight of an ocean and the speed of a storm, 35 miles an hour, a velocity no one thought syrup could reach. People who stood on Commercial Street were lifted off their feet not by the syrup, but by the air it displaced. Horses vanished beneath it. Carts were overturned. A truck weighing more than a ton was thrown into the curb like driftwood. The sound was not a roar. Survivors said it was more like a low, continuous hum, the voice of something enormous and unstoppable, arriving without anger, only momentum. In the space of a breath, the North End had no streets, only a moving, churning tide. The first instinct was to run, but molasses does not allow running. It catches, it holds, it drags. Men found themselves waist-deep in the sticky flood within seconds. Some tried to climb the wreckage, only to be pulled back as if the syrup had hands. Others sank slowly, unable to lift their legs against the weight tightening around them. Buildings collapsed under the force. Wooden storefronts folded inward like paper soaked in water. A piece of steel from the tank, weighing nearly a ton, was thrown into the supports of the elevated railway. A train had passed just seconds before the metal struck. The air itself became sweet, heavy, suffocating. Not with warmth, but with the thick, cloying scent of molasses beginning to cool. Firefighters and sailors rushed from nearby stations and ships, rope in hand, boots sinking into the street that was no longer a street. They pulled survivors free when they could. Sometimes they grasped only clothing, sometimes only an arm. Horses fared worse. They fought, thrashed, cried out, and then fell silent beneath the syrup, unable to lift their own weight against it. For hours the tide did not retreat. It settled, it thickened, it pinned debris, bodies, timber, carts, and brick together into something unrecognizable. By the end of the day, 21 people were gone. More than 150 were injured. And Boston, a city that had endured blizzards, fires, and storms, found itself humbled by sweetness turned deadly. Cleanup began before survivors had even finished counting the missing. Workers brought sand, seawater pumps, and high-pressure hoses, but nothing behaved as expected. Molasses clung to cobblestones and doorways, thickening in the cold until each step sounded like a boot being torn from glue. They washed the streets until the water in Boston Harbor turned brown. They scraped porches in stairwells. They shoveled syrup from cellars in heavy, heaving motions. Everywhere they went, the sweetness followed them. On boots, on coats, on skin. For days, the city felt sticky. For weeks, it smelled of sugar. For years, residents swore that on warm afternoons, if the wind shifted just right, the North End still carried a faint, ghostly sweetness. The disaster left more than physical debris. Families were displaced. Injuries lingered. Businesses near the tank never reopened. And every person who had lived through it learned a quiet truth. Tragedy does not always arrive with fire or water. Sometimes it comes in the form of what should have been harmless. What was meant to be fuel for factories and distilleries had become proof of how fragile industry could be when speed replaced caution. And in that realization, the city braced itself for the reckoning that would follow. The legal battle began almost before the streets dried. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, owner of the Purity Distilling Company, insisted that the tank had been sabotaged. They argued that anarchists, still active in the city after the war, had caused the collapse. But the people of the North End had lived beside the tank. They had heard its groans, seen its leaks, watched it shed molasses like sweat on summer days. They knew better. The court heard testimonies from metal workers, engineers, laborers, and residents who had passed the tank daily. They spoke of the thin steel plates, the inadequate rivets, the missing tests, the hurried construction. They spoke of the paint, the same color as molasses, brushed across its surface to hide what everyone knew was wrong. For 6 years the hearings continued. 6 years of documents, diagrams, and study. 6 years during which experts proved what the neighborhood had understood all along. The tank had never been safe. In the end, the court ruled against the company. Damages were paid, between $500,000 and $1 million in total, a fortune then, though small, compared to the lives lost. But the true consequence was not financial, it was legislative. Boston and the country beyond it could no longer pretend that industry could regulate itself. It was a new era that was beginning. The collapse forced the nation to confront something it had long ignored. Industrial progress without oversight was a danger no city could bear. New building codes emerged, requirements for engineering oversight, for structural testing, for proper materials, for inspections before and after construction. Zoning laws followed, preventing hazardous structures from rising beside homes, schools, and narrow streets. These regulations spread far beyond Boston. They shaped how factories were built, how storage tanks were reinforced, how engineers signed off on designs. The molasses flood became a case study in what happens when cost outruns caution. Universities taught it, lawyers cited it, inspectors remembered it. A tragedy born from one neighborhood became a safeguard for thousands of others. And though the North End rebuilt, the lesson stayed, written not on plaques or monuments, but in blueprints, laws, and the quiet insistence that no structure should be trusted simply because it stands tall. Today, nothing remains of the tank. Commercial Street is busy again, brighter, louder, unaware. People walk past the place where the steel once rose, never imagining that sweetness once carried the weight of a wave. But the story lingers, not because of the disaster alone, but because of what it revealed. How a quiet sound in winter can warn of what a city does not wish to see. How ordinary routines can hide extraordinary danger. How lives can be changed not only by storms and wars, but by a single structure built without care. A century later, on warm days, some residents still say the wind carries a hint of molasses, faint, distant, almost imagined. But stories like this are never fully gone. They stay where they happened, settled into the bricks, the harbor air, and the quiet places where cities remember their past.